Hello everyone and welcome back to the finals of the Magnus Carlsen chess tour. Yes, I'm back home and hope everything is finally okay with the audio now. We are starting off the video with the Armageddon game, as I've been traveling and I didn't get a chance to cover all the games, but I will get back to some of the nicer ones tomorrow. However, I will mention what happened so far. So this is the Armageddon, but before that, of course, we had 4 rapid games and 2 blitz games. In the rapid games, first Magnus took the lead and then Hikaru retaliated in game 3, so of course game 4 ended in a draw. They went into the blitz section and then Hikaru won game 1 in the blitz. Magnus gave up a pawn. He wanted to try and hold the draw with opposite colored bishops being a pawn down, but Hikaru was able to win that, and then Magnus was able to win on demand in game 6. That's the second game of the blitz, forcing Armageddon. And now we have the Armageddon game. Crazy stuff where Magnus chose black. Magnus always gets to choose what color he wants in Armageddon, as he qualified for the grand final by winning one of the previous events. So that being said, let's check it out. So Hikaru with the white pieces needs to win this game. It's Armageddon, 5 minutes for Hikaru on the clock and 4 minutes for Magnus. He opens with e4. Sorry about that. And will we again see the Berlin defense? We have e5 by Magnus, we have knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to b5. So the Ruy Lopez is on the board, and yes, of course we will. The Berlin defense, knight to f6 by Magnus. We have d3 by Hikaru and bishop to c5. And now this trade, we've seen this plenty of times in their clashes during the past few days. D captures on c6 and knight b to d2. Maybe the knight coming to c4, going after the e5 pawn. We have bishop to e6 and now h3, preparing a different line. We have knight to d7, now preparing f6 to strengthen the e5 pawn, and knight to f1 now. The pawn is coming to g4, and this knight will be coming to g3. So f6 by Magnus strengthens this pawn, and now there is one game in the database where bishop to e3 was played, but here we have the instant g4 by Hikaru, which is a new move, so already as of move 9 we have a completely new game. Queen e7 by Magnus, as those pawns are already far advanced. You don't want to probably castle kingside, so Magnus rushes queenside. First knight g3, of course, and then we have queenside castles by Magnus, queen to e2. Hikaru also plans to play bishop to e3 and castle queenside. King to b8 by Magnus, and now a3. So Nakamura needs to stir something up, and Magnus just needs to keep everything in order to not gamble too much, as a draw is the same as a win for him in this game. Bishop back to b6, and now bishop to e3. Hikaru needs to continue developing the castle. We have knight to f8, shifting the knight over to g6. Then it's possible for the knight at some point to come to h4. We have castles by Hikaru, and now knight to g6. We have knight to h5, putting pressure on the g7 pawn. If the queen moves, it's going to be a liability. So here, bishop captures on e3, queen captures, Magnus trades off one of the bishops, and now pushes c5. So gaining complete control over the d4 square, and if necessary at any point, Magnus can go c4 to create some sort of a breakthrough in the center. So knight d2 by Hikaru, shifting the knight over to the queen side, and now b6, just giving that c5 pawn additional protection, weakening the light squares somewhat, but Magnus still has a light square bishop, so it's not a problem. You can just shift it over there if needed. Knight to b1 by Hikaru, preparing knight to c3. From there you can go to b5, to d5 if needed, to a4 also. We have knight to h4 by Magnus, now preparing to push the pawn to g5, create a sort of a safe haven on f4 for this knight, and then shift the knight back, knight to g6 and then to f4. It will be an excellent square for the knight, and also by this maneuver you will finally deal with Hikaru's pesky knight on h5. So rook h to g1 by Hikaru, and now g5 as planned, not allowing any pushes like g5 or f4. We have knight to c3, finally bringing that knight into the game, and now knight back to g6. Now the knight is coming to f4, as it is an excellent outpost for the knight. We have king to b1 by Hikaru, a nice prophylactic move as always, and now knight to f4. And now this is a beautiful knight. You don't want it there like at all, so you need to capture this. So knight captures, g captures by Magnus, doubles his pawn, but it's not a problem as it comes with tempo, and also h5 is coming. So here we have queen to e2 and now h5 by Magnus. He wants to do captures and then double up his rooks on the h file to trade off the rooks and then ensure that he has a very simple game to play. So f3, Hikaru strengthens the g4 pawn. We have captures as planned, and now rook to h3. Now putting pressure on the f3 pawn and also preparing the doubling of the rooks on the h file. Rook to g2 by Hikaru, and now rook d to h8. We have rook d to g1, doubling up on the g file. Of course, Hikaru now wants to make a breakthrough with the g5. So rook to h1 by Magnus. Now Magnus can just trade off one of the rooks at will. And here Hikaru plays b3, and this allows Magnus a very sneaky idea. Here Magnus pushes c4. He sacrifices a pawn, well, not really sacrifices a pawn because he's gonna grab the a3 pawn, but he will mess up white's pawn structure in the center here. So d captures on c4 by Hikaru. We have queen captures on a3, and now finally g5. Here Magnus trades. You could also capture and then trade, but Magnus prefers to just trade. A rook captures on g5, and now a5. If the knight moves, then a4 could be very strong, busting open the white king's position. If knight to b5, just going after the queen, not a problem. Queen c5 just puts pressure on the rook on g1. Not much here for white. So queen to d3, and now king to b7. Hikaru is much better on time, and remember, there is no increment in Armageddon. If anyone flags anyone, then the game's over. So rook to g7, now gaining control of the 7th rank, but now Magnus doesn't like this. He was waiting for this, and only now does he trade rooks. So captures, and rook to h7, preventing any harm from, you know, strolling through the 7th rank. So knight to a4, Hikaru now prepares c5. Could be an idea if if c5, let's say pawn captures, queen b5 check, might be interesting. However, we have queen to d6. Immediately Magnus offers a queen trade, and now of course Hikaru, if Hikaru trades, this is very comfortable for black to hold. Magnus very confident that he will be able to hold this. So instead, after this queen to d6, Hikaru moves the queen to c3. I was watching this game live with Yelena, and Yelena mentioned that Hikaru should play queen to c3 here, which he did. And now, let's say rook to g5, going after the e5 pawn could be possible, but bishop to d7. Magnus stops this in a very tricky idea. Now, if you try something like this, then allowing this rook to go for h1 will be a bit too dangerous. Let's say bishop captures, and now this is never a problem, because rook to h1 check, king a2, and now queen d7. Let's say goes after this pawn. If queen here, then queen here, threatens checkmate. And if you block this, then just rook here, and there is no more. Not much you can do here. If king blocks, the defend is just queen captures, you create a passed pawn. White just falls apart here. So Hikaru must retreat with the knight to b2, and then now comes rook to h3. Again, putting pressure on the h3 pawn. Rook to d1, pushing Magnus's queen back, queen e7, and now knight to d3. A really interesting move by Hikaru, because here Hikaru says, if you capture, I'm just going to play knight to c5 check, and your rook will be under attack. But this is exactly what Magnus does. He plays rook captures on f3. And what's the point here? Well, the point is, if knight to c5 check, then Magnus captures with the queen. It's not a problem, because now after queen captures on f3, he's going to play bishop to c6, and black is up a pawn here. White has a doubled c-pawn. And even though Hikaru would be up the exchange here, Magnus says, you're not breaking through this. My light square bishop will take care of the light squares here, so you will not get many chances to attack the pawns which are on dark squares. This pawn is very weak. I'm going to play this, bust open the king's position, and, well, I will hold this very easily. So here, after rook captures on f3, Hikaru played queen captures on e5, offers a queen trade, but now something very interesting happens, as it usually does when we reach the position from the thumbnail. Feel free to pause the video here and find an idea that Magnus played while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on maybe not finding the absolute best move, but for the Armageddon where draw is enough, it is definitely the best move. Here, for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, Magnus played rook captures on d3, and he sacrificed the queen. Well, gave up the queen for a knight and the rook. Here Hikaru has nothing better. He has to accept the queen trade, not the queen trade, he has to accept the queen. Rook captures on d1 with check, king to b2, and now bishop to c6. And now each player has a passed pawn. However, it's gonna be very, very interesting. So e5, Hikaru starts pushing his passed pawn, and Magnus does the same. f3, we have queen to f6, and now rook to d2, preparing the push of the pawn to f2. e6 and now f2, and Hikaru pushes the pawn to e7. Now with ideas of maybe queen captures bishop with check, king captures, and promoting the pawn to a queen. So you have to be ready for this. So rook to e2, and Magnus prevents against this tactic. Now this does absolutely nothing. So here queen to f7. And now a very easy way to handle things for Magnus, just rook captures on e7. And here if you capture, I mean, there's nothing better. If you capture, then just pawn to f1 gets queen into the game. So here Hikaru, of course, has to capture on f2, but now rook g7. And now, is this a fortress or is this not a fortress? There's always a saying from Magnus that Magnus doesn't believe in fortresses, but maybe he believes in one when he really needs one to win the entire event. So we'll see what happens. Queen f4, and now rook to g2. And of course, it's not just if this is a fortress or not, but it's also whether Hikaru can flag Magnus or not. So queen to e5 and rook to g6. And Hikaru was some minute and 40 on the clock, I believe, here, in Magnus around minute and 10 seconds. Maybe not exactly those times, but Hikaru was somewhat up on time. So rook back to g6, and now c3. Hikaru needs to create some chances, so he must push the pawns. Rook g2 check, king to c1. Rook to g4, Magnus just shifting between this square and the one guarded by the bishop, so he doesn't have to think too much and waste time. We have queen e6, hoping that Magnus blunders the rook, as it does tend to happen in Armageddon. Rook to e4, challenging the queen, queen f7, and now rook to e1 check. King d2, challenging the rook, and now rook to e4. We have b4, and now a captures on b4, grabbing that pawn. C captures, and now b5. The queen protects the pawn, so of course you cannot capture it. b5, and now you cannot push the pawn because the b4 pawn hangs, so here Hikaru trades. We have c captures, bishop captures, and queen to d5 check. Almost winning the rook, but not quite, as bishop c6 just blocks check and defends the rook. Queen to c5, and now rook to e6. Here we have king to c3. Hikaru starts bringing the king into the game, and now rook to d6. We have b5, and now bishop to d7, preparing bishop to c8. And here the fortress seems to be created, as now the king guards the bishop will come to c8, the king will guard the bishop, and the pawn prevents anything from reaching b6 or d6. And Carlsen's plan is now, it doesn't matter how fast you are, you're not flagging me, I'm just going to move the rook. Rook b6, rook d6, rook b6, rook d6. And even if Magnus just pre-moves these moves, it's impossible for white to win. Well, almost impossible. So queen to e5, and now bishop to c8. We have king to c4, and now rook back to b6. We have king to c5, but now king b8. We have queen to e8, and again rook to d6. We have queen to f8, now trying something just to gain time, but here Magnus just played rook to b6, and Hikaru went into a deep think. He went to lower with time even than Magnus had. He started laughing, and it was in this position that the players agreed to a draw. And with this draw, Magnus Carlsen is the winner of the match, and by that he wins the match against Hikaru 4-3. So really, really intense match. They were, trading blow for blow, and in the end Magnus prevailed, but it was incredible. Like, Hikaru had everything. He won the first blitz game, he just needed a draw in the second one, then Magnus won out of nowhere, and then Magnus just chose black. And it's very hard when you're so close to the victory, Magnus wins, and then you're forced to play Armageddon, and then Magnus chooses black and says, okay, now you have to beat me with white. Definitely not a pleasant position to be in, but in the end someone has to win, and this time it was Magnus who wins the entire Magnus Carlsen chess tour. He wins the first prize, I believe $60,000 just for this tournament, or maybe more. Maybe the difference between the first place and second place is $60,000. I'm not sure. We'll have to check that. But it's either $60,000 or $100,000, something along those lines. But yeah. Really incredible stuff. Sorry I didn't manage to upload the other games as I was returning home from my vacation, but I will tend to them tomorrow. So if you have any favorites, do use hashtag suggestion in the comments. I would like to thank Eyal Verad, Michael van Melkebeke, Daniel Duranka, Christopher Paran, and Tom Haythorn White for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check two of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the games we haven't covered from the Magnus Carlsen chess tour, checking up on your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world, and of course continuing the Morphy saga. So thank you all, I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.